Our first speaker is Jeremy Miller. He is the monitoring coordinator at the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve in Maine, and he is a leading expert for NOAA's system-wide monitoring program, which measures water quality across the nation. Jeremy is also the Maine state coordinator for the Marine Invader Monitoring and Information Collaborative, or MIMIC, and coordinates 40+ community scientists in conducting monthly monitoring for marine invasive species at long-term monitoring sites in Maine. He's an active participant on the Maine Marine Invasive Species Work Group and the Maine Invasive Species Network, and is involved in many Wells Reserve research and outreach initiatives. Jeremy also teaches part-time at the University of New England, where he also received his degree in environmental science and marine biology. So I will pass it over to you, Jeremy.
Excellent. Thank you, Aly. And can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Coming through all right. And now I will try the dreaded share screen and see if this all goes smoothly. And as I'm bringing up my talk, there's quite a bit of buzz about this first ever marine portion for the RISC here, so no pressure, right? So with that, I'd like to thank Aly and the other conveners of this workshop for asking me to come and speak. And also just to take a second, say I'm honored to be on this panel with some distinguished colleagues, Dr. Carlton and Dr. Dijkstra, who are long-term great scientists in this field and people that I have leaned on greatly in learning a little bit about invasive species. So I'm happy to set the stage here a little bit about what we're seeing in a rapidly warming Gulf of Maine and how we're using citizen scientists that track the spread and occurrence of marine invasive species. So just quickly about who I am and who's having me be here today, allowing me to be here to talk with you. We're part of the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. We're funded by NOAA. There's 29 reserves around the country. We're happy to announce a new reserve in Connecticut as of 2022, which is fantastic. And we're basically set up, to study our nation's estuaries, short-term variability and long-term changes in our nation's estuaries. And we're down in Wells, Maine. If you've never been to our site, please come and visit. It's an awesome place to come take a walk. We got trails and just a beautiful old saltwater farm that's been rescued and turned into this fantastic research and education outpost. And that's exactly what we're all about. We have a few robust programs at the reserve and throughout the NEAR system across the country. And that's our education programs, our research and monitoring programs. We're also stewards of the land that we're on and that we protect, and as well as our coastal training program, which is a fantastic program that helps interact between scientists and managers and people who need to use that kind of data. So Aly mentioned the system-wide monitoring program, or SWAMP. This is in place at all 29 reserves around the country, and we're focused on abiotic monitoring of water quality, weather, nutrients, but also of things like marsh elevation sets, which are sediment elevation tables. I'm looking at how long-term changes like climate change and sea level rise are impacting our nation's estuaries. But we also have a biological component to that, and a piece of that is invasive species, which I'm here to talk to you a little bit about. So I want to set the stage a little bit of where we're looking at invasive species. So our friends at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute have been doing a really good job over the last decade of tracking ocean surface temperatures in the Gulf of Maine. And we're all alarmed, and this is a pretty well-known fact now to people in the Northeast, especially marine folks, that Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. Kind of got kicked off with the 2012 temperature anomaly, and I say anomaly because we're finding out now a decade later that apparently that wasn't so anomalous, unfortunately. This past fall was the second warmest record in the Gulf of Maine, and I checked the Western Shelf buoy a few days back. We still had 46 degrees, 7.8 Celsius water temperature in mid-January. So that's just blowing my mind. And it's taking a lot longer for the Gulf to cool back off, basically in the falls and winter. So this is having implications to what we're seeing, right? So I thought I'd try to set the stage a little bit, do a little Marine Invasives 101 before my colleagues get up and talk hard science with you about some of these species. But generally, our estuaries and our coasts are most heavily invaded. The vectors here are shipping, aquaculture. Of course, a lot of that stuff is happening in our ports, in our bays. So estuaries are a big focus. And working in a National Estuarine Research Reserve System, this fits very nicely with our research missions. And of course, impacts from climate change are also affecting estuaries in an extreme fashion. As this paper back in 2013 noted, we're going to see a lot of impacts from climate change quickly in our estuaries. And we're already seeing some of that in some of the data that we're looking at. Marine invasive species also present some challenges. Our species represent a pretty complex range of taxa and life histories. We know much less about their behavior outside of their native ranges, and sometimes we don't know much about their behavior in their native ranges. Some of these species, namely tunicates, can be cryptogenic, and their identification can be quite difficult especially for community members. So we'll get to that in a second. But of course, all these things, just like Stas did a great job of laying the groundwork for invasive species, these things are impacting our economies and our ecology, right? They're having impacts on things like fisheries, aquaculture, recreation, tourism. So the graph down here is just showing 2020 commercial landings for Maine. Of course, lobster is the big blue piece of the pie. We love our lobster in Maine. But what I want you to see is this little 3% soft shell clams down here. I know 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about how much 3% is of $516 million, that starts to be a little more significant. And I hope to have some time to get to a quick case study on that in just a second. But I wanted to talk to you about MIMIC, why I'm here, and the Marine Invader Monitoring and Information Collaborative. So MIMIC was started in 2008 out of the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. Great girl, Adrian Papel, who's been heavily involved in invasive species, marine invasive species in New England, got this program started off with some colleagues of hers. And it's a network of trained volunteer scientists and state or university staff who basically monitor for marine invasive species presence and absence along the New England coast. And we're focused on 3 habitat types: docks, tide pools, and cobble shores. And some of the goals of the program are, again, getting back to some of what Stas was talking about, early detection. That's huge with invasive species, and that doesn't stop in the marine world. And it's almost even more important in the marine world because the environment we're working in is very open. The Gulf of Maine is a huge place, and it's hard to close things off. And once something becomes established, it's very tough to manage. Education is a big part of this. We want to be talking to our community members and educating people who use the coast. Coastal access and fisheries is a big thing in Maine. And we want to educate those people about how those environments are changing. And of course, we want to provide usable data as well. So we do our best to make sure that this data is coming in a sound fashion and that data is then available online as well. So just a quick look at our MIMIC site since 2008. You can see we have a pretty strong coverage of Massachusetts. We had sites as far down in Rhode Island. I'm not sure if those sites are still up and functioning. We 114 sites, over 15 partners. So again, it's all about collaborations in making these observations work. One thing I think we need more of on the ground, especially in the marine world, is observations in the field. And this is a way of getting at that. So we have to provide our volunteers with the resources they need to accomplish this Herculean feat. So one of those things is a good data sheet. We have a subset of invasive species that we picked because we felt the former felt that these were easy to identify in the field, and they were also posing some immediate threats and immediate dangers to our environment, things that we knew were on the way and were already established. We also have another great resource, which are these identification cards. Credit is due to Mass CCM as well as Barbara Warren, at Salem Sound Coast Watch, helping develop these cards. These are a tremendous resource for our volunteers. They have the species we're looking for on one side. On the other side, they have similar species or native species. So they're not mixing up on native versus invasive species, which is really important. Of course, we have our volunteer monitoring guide that state coordinators like I use to help maintain our volunteers and coordinate the program. And of course, the big thing is annual trainings and site visits. I do a lot of boots on the ground work with my volunteers. I think it's super important to hold those annual trainings every year, to get everyone refreshed on protocols and identification, and also to perform site visits throughout the year. So I have my eyes on the sites as well, making sure that the data I'm seeing coming in makes sense. There's also some great online resources. So Mass CCM has done a great story map for the MIMIC program, and I urge people to go there. You can really just Google Mass CCM MIMIC and get to this pretty easily. It has an introduction to the program. We have all of our species laid out with really nice high-grade photography and some morphological features for identification. There's a species map where you can click on and off different species, see where they're being found in our MIMIC sites. So really cool online resources there. And this is what we're hoping is making this very real citizen scientists at work, right? Actually having well-trained community members doing real science that can help inform other researchers in the area and other programs that are looking at invasive species. So what are we seeing? I just wanted to share some photos and a little bit of results and observations from MIMIC. One of the easiest things to show is our impact to kelp. And I know Jenn's going to talk about this, so I'll leave the science behind these organisms to her. But it doesn't take a trained professional or a scientist to see the difference what's happening seasonally with our kelp. So this is kelp from the same dock at Peaks Island, May of 2018 on the left, August of that same year on the right. Almost everything you're seeing on this kelp is invasive. And kelp is becoming quite a big aquaculture piece in the Gulf of Maine. So, this is an issue. Almost everything you're seeing on these kelp, and believe it or not, there is kelp under there. So pretty impressive fouling in the summer. It's also happening on lobster traps and fishing gear, right? So these are instances for me to be able to interact with folks. I was actually talking with this lobsterman about this issue and how he can better manage his traps, and telling him not to power wash at the docks, which wasn't something we wanted to do, as these things have a tendency to spread by fragmentation. So some neat immediate impacts. These are fouling tunicates on anchors off of Chebeague Island, one of the sites that I work at. So again, very, very real impacts to our coastal communities, people who are working in these environments. So I wanted to go over a couple keys to using citizen scientists, because I've been at this since 2008. I've worked with literally hundreds of people at this point, and I have some volunteers who have been with the program since 2008, which is pretty impressive. And I'll tell you, some of those folks are as good or better at identifying some of these organisms as some scientists I've been in the field with. So they really do grow with the program. So proper training and resources, really making sure they have the resources they need to be confident in what they're doing in the field. Communication, emailing with these folks. You don't know how many emails I get a week. Is this, or I'm at this site and look what I found. Photos and site visits, communicating with them and making sure they're interacting is really important. Data QA, QC, and leaning on the experts. Thank you, Jenn. Thank you, Dr. Carlton. I've used them both numerous times in emails to check in on a species or make sure what I was seeing was real. Dr. Larry Harris at UNH, Dr. Judy Peterson at MIT, all these experts that are out there, I never had a single one of them email me back, I'm too busy or I'm not interested. So really leaning on the experts in these fields has really helped this program to have some confidence in some of the tougher ID stuff. And of course, providing feedback and results to your volunteers is important. And to that, I'll speak just really quickly about numbers that we're seeing coming out of MINIC. Some of these sites I put in parentheses here, last year and this year. And you see some of our sites just in the last year have gained one or two more invasive species that have just showed up that weren't present at that site, some going back to 2008. So we're seeing some pretty immediate changes in our fouling communities. If these species persist, as time will tell, and docks are our most heavily invaded piece of the puzzle. Again, providing that data that actually helps our partners and provides information to them. We partner with the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership to do invasive species monitoring in Casco Bay, and they used our mimic data in their most recent State of the Bay report. Had a nice little piece on invasive species and kind of what we're seeing in our preliminary data. Now, granted, this data is only about 4 or 5 years old at some sites, but we're already seeing some interesting trends pop out and some new species arriving, which is interesting. This data is tough to work with because there's quite a bit of just presence absence data and not so much with the abundant stuff, but we're getting around that. So, Aly, do I have another couple of minutes? I'm sorry, I did not look at time. How am I doing?
Yes, you have time for just a couple more minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to quickly run through a quick case study with you guys. Green crabs are like the poster child for marine invasive species in Maine. And this was a crab graph that we made at the Wells Reserve. I love that guy to show that. We were trapping crabs, but this is not a new issue. These are pictures from 1953 in Ipswich, Massachusetts, of crab trappers trying to get green crabs out of the system. These are pesticide barriers in Jonesport, Maine, where we're dipping herring in pesticide, hanging them on ropes so the green crabs would eat them and die. So my point here being is that some of these invasions are not new. They've been around for a long time, but what's driving their booms and busts? And I think a lot of that has to do with climate and climate change. A lot of the thought was that green crabs were being held back in winter months because of the harsh New England winters. As our winters start to get milder and temperatures and water temperatures continue to be more moderate in the falls and winters, we're thinking that these populations are doing much better and having much bigger ecosystem impacts as we see climate change and persisting in the Gulf of Maine. So it's a study by Hilary Nichols looking at eelgrass loss by green crab predation. And I'll leave you with this. This is my Dr. Seuss slide. 1 crab, 2 crab, green, blue crabs. So I've been at the reserve for going on 16 years now, and I'd never seen a blue crab in our system until last year. Do range expansions, which are caused by climate change, in my opinion, which is human induced, do those start equaling invasives, right, or invasive species? So these are interesting questions as we move forward in the marine world. It's a complex and big world, and it's an open system, and we're doing our best to walk that line of monitoring and information, but also management and trying to get at some of the issues affecting fisheries. So I will end there. Thank you very much. And these are my invasive species, Lucas and Camille. And I am at jmiller@wellsmere.org and would love to talk to any of you terrestrial or freshwater folks about invasive species anytime. So thank you so much for having me, and look forward to the conversation coming up.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was fantastic. We do have a question in the chat for you. How do you maintain volunteer participation for programming, staffing continuity for MIMIC? And do you have any tips for engaging the public or recruiting volunteers?
Yeah. So I guess some of the points I made in my slide there about really having close communication and constant contact with your volunteers. I have volunteers come and go all the time. Not all of them stick. What I try, so for instance, in the spring of last year, I had a new site come up and I had to train, I had to get a bunch of new volunteers. Again, I leaned on a friend organization, Friends of Casco Bay, who do tons of work with volunteers. And I quickly had 12 people signed up and ready to do MIMIC. After one training event and one real world event, I was down to 4. But those 4 volunteers out of that 12 are rock steady. So sometimes you just have to find the right people, be happy with 1 or 2 really good volunteers as opposed to 6 all right volunteers who show up sometimes and sometimes don't. But this is the world of volunteers, and it's very tough, and those are great questions. I wish I had a magic trick for you. Volunteers, you can only push them so far because after all, they're volunteering their time. But yeah, engaging them, giving them feedback, making sure, like I shared that Casco Bay report with my volunteers as soon as it came out, because that's their data at work, right, out in their community. So that can be really powerful. So yeah, providing those real world experiences to them and having a real relationship with them, I think is important. I hope that answered it a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremy. We'll have questions at the end for Jeremy and the others. So now we are going to move on to our next speaker, who I'd like to introduce, Dr. Jim Carlton, who is a professor of marine sciences emeritus at Williams College in Connecticut and director emeritus of Williams College Mystic Seaport, Ocean, and Coastal Studies program. His research is focused on the environmental history of estuaries and coastal marine ecosystems, including species invasion and modern day extinction, He founded the journal Biological Invasions, is a Pew Fellow for Marine Conservation, and was co-chair of the National Academy of Sciences Marine Biodiversity Committee, which produced Understanding Marine Biodiversity, a research agenda for the nation, and co-chair of the NASS NRC Committee advising on settling ballast water standards to reduce species introduction. Jim received his degrees at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and his postdoc work at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Carlton. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. And thanks for the opportunity. What I'd like to do for just a few minutes is walk through some scenarios about what we might be looking at in the future relative to how climate change might interact with marine invasions in particular, but some of these aspects have, of course, broader applicability to other habitats as well. There are many ways in which we can ask questions about how coastal temperatures will alter invasions in the future. I'm going to walk through a couple of them. The first one has to do with how geographic sources of new invasions might change, and the other has to do with a more layered model about how temperature increases could alter the outcomes of the process of invasions, the invasion sequence.
Jim, before you get going, can you just enter presentation mode? I'm so sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're perfect. Great. Thank you.
That's good. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Under the general aegis of surprise reduction, we know that there are going to be 2 major geographic sources for invasions of New England in the future in the marine environment. The one is poleward invasions, the movement of southern species into higher latitudes, northern latitudes here, and of course the opposite picture in the southern hemisphere. This is happening all over the world in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine environments, and hundreds, thousands of species may be in motion at this time. These are basically species expansions, and if they are by rafting or larval dispersal, likely not preventable or presenting a management challenge. The other arm of this is overseas invasions. arrival of novel species from overseas, both of them mediated in no small part by the fact that when we look at New England as a model system, these species are arriving in areas which have historically been too cold. They may have been arriving for a great length of time, but were never able to establish because of the historical climate of New England. For overseas invasions, we might be looking at species transported by anthropogenic vectors, and those would be potentially preventable. A key aspect of this is that poleward invasions, range expansions, may also be mediated by anthropogenic vectors, thus moving over into the bin of potentially preventable as well. Although in many scenarios, poleward invasions are treated as entirely natural by ocean currents, but actually in many cases, we do not have evidence to sort out anthropogenic vectors from ocean currents or other vectors. Overall, this concept has broad applicability worldwide. We talked about Caribbean creep, the movement of Caribbean species up into the southeast coast of the United States. This is a well-known phenomenon. Panama creep, or a Panamic species moving up into North America. African creep, recently defined for the movement of African species into the higher parts of, into the northern parts of the Mediterranean and into other parts of Europe. For us, it's Chesapeake creep. It's the species, the many species, potentially hundreds over the coming decades, that are classically mid-Atlantic species, occurring no further north than Chesapeake Bay, which are inexorably moving in to the New England arena. Scenario 2 is how we might alter the outcome of the invasion process and thus invasion timing due to climate change scenarios. And these, of course, are also very complex. In our work, we recognize a fine-grained model of the invasion process. Here it's shown as 8 different steps along the way. It begins with a resonant species pool, which in species that get entrained, called vector acquisition. From that resonant species pool, there is a transport stage. There's an arrival stage. You can arrive but not leave the vector. So if you leave the vector, that is the vector exit, called inoculation. Survival is another distinct phase. You may not make it after you get released. You may not make it any further. Reproduction is a key step, as you all know in your work. Colonization, we don't get to introduction until about step 7 in this scenario. Establishment has to be persistent in order to avoid population extinction. And then species may spread or not, depending upon where they've been introduced and their biology. Each of these has a probability associated with them, which permits us to do some quantification along the right-hand side, and even some experimentation to get more refined data as to how we might be able to be more predictive along this pathway. How does climate change work in here? Climate change will affect the donor species pool. It changes the number and the kinds of species that are available for transport, wherever that might be in the world, and their abundance. And in turn, changing abundance of species alters the probability of vector engagement. On many routes, depending on what those are, and those are a huge number, survival may be increased during transit because of warming temperatures. Others might, of course, be decreased survival, but in this scenario, we might increase survival in transit to the target region. Once a species has entered the environment, milder or warmer climates in the recipient region could increase the likelihood of post-release survival, where in historical times, that might have been almost instantaneous death upon release. After and during reproduction, altered growth rates, shortened times to reproduction, potentially increased food resources could have a dramatic effect on the success of the species. And then finally, the potential range expansion could link directly to local abundance, increased densities, increasing the probability of colonization beyond the site of initial introduction. So we have a whole series of steps here in where we could be altering along the pathway the probabilities of what might be happening. Basically, it's a changes in donor region versus a changes in recipient region with the complexities at a species level. So knowledge of a particular species, physiology, biology, ecological interactions working in here. For scenario one, I'll give you a few quick examples of the kinds of things we've been seeing in recent decades or recent years. Back in the 1980s, late 70s, 80s, bryozoan called Bugula neratina, common well to our south, began appearing in Long Island Sound and in New England in general. This now forms rich purple communities along the sides of marina floats and docks and pilings, an invasion of a warmer water species moving up into historically cold New England. A more recent invasion is a sea anemone that we expect will become increasingly common in Long Island Sound, moving north potentially into the Gulf of Maine, is Aptassiogeton eruptorantia. The Latin name is larger than the sea anemone. It's very distinctive. It has vertical rows of pink and red spots, first detected about a decade ago in a marina in Rhode Island. We believe now that the species, which eyebrow raising we would not have predicted could overwinter in New England, we think is probably likely established in Rhode Island and surviving the cold temperatures there and reappearing in the spring. It was found also in a marina in Brooklyn a couple of years ago. Future invasions, easy to predict in many ways, is a golf ball sized sea squirt called Stylia plicata. This is a species well known to form massive biofouling aggregations and accumulations. It has been found on the hull of a resonant vessel in the Mystic River, and we expect the species to be an example of one, the ghost of invasion's future, that may be able to establish in Long Island Sound and then continue to move north. Another species that would be a spectacular invasion in the marine environment of New England would be what's called the spaghetti weed. It's an animal, it's a bryozoan, Zobotrion. The Latin name has changed recently, but we call it zobot. And we have seen massive colonies of this in Southern California harbors that are 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It's a dominant and predominant fouling organism. This one has appeared every few years now in New England and in New Bedford rather predictably, and we expect we might begin to see it overwinter in the not too distant future. It's now found from the Carolinas and south. And in terms of an immediate management challenge, we are looking at warm water wood boring species, which are going to be moving north. This includes shipworms, teredos, which are bivalve mollusks. These are clam relatives, and gribbles, which are small marine isopods. Both of them are extremely effective at destroying and removing wood from the marine environment. We have only one species of shipworm and one species of gribble in our New England harbors. There are many more species of both to our south. In terms of overseas invasions, the arrival of novel species from overseas, we have, as many of you know, remarkably, 4 species of shrimp have appeared in New England from Europe and Asia only in the last 20 years. The first of these is Palamon macrodactylus, a species from the Western Pacific, Korea, Japan, and China, which appeared in 2001 in the Bronx River in New York and now occurs from New Hampshire to Florida. We didn't learn about this species for about a decade after its initial collection, but as soon as it was publicly announced, we realized it was rather common up and down the New England coast. When we went looking for Palamon macrodactylus north of Cape Cod in 2010 to see whether or not it had bridged Cape Cod and was heading north and east, to our surprise, in Salem, Massachusetts, we found Palamon elegans abundant at the docks at that site, at that marina. No one had noticed it apparently very distinctive blue and orange, very pretty appendages, which now occurs from Maine to Connecticut. It is the most common tide pool shrimp now on the rocky shores at places like Weekapaug Point in Rhode Island. Lysmata vittata, the Asian peppermint shrimp, cannot be mistaken, appeared in Chesapeake Bay in 2013. iNaturalist, on iNaturalist, we saw a photo of it from Long Island Sound from 2021. So it appears to be moving regularly along the coast and will likely continue to the north, the Asian peppermint shrimp. And Palamon aspersus, the Baltic shrimp from Western and Northern Europe, appeared in 2011 in Newfoundland. It's already dropped down into the southern parts of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and we expect that it will jump around through Nova Scotia and very likely appear in the Gulf of Maine and moving south in the not too distant future. All four of these species are becoming relatively abundant where they are, and sometimes remarkably so. We have very little knowledge of their biology or ecology at this time in the Northwest Atlantic, but they are a signal for us. All of these species had the opportunity to invade for many decades, and their arrival and establishment in a relatively short period of time would appear to be a signal of change. But exactly where along the pathways and these steps those changes have occurred, we do not yet have a clear resolution. This is just a very quick taste of a great many species that we are tracking these days that are both from overseas, from other continents, and species that are just on our southern border. Every year we see something new and we get a new invasion on a very regular basis. Hard to keep up with this. And I'll just end by saying that one of our great challenges in the marine environment, and I do not know how our colleagues are doing in this regard in terrestrial or freshwater environments, is the lack of taxonomists to identify a great many of the species that we find. If we find a new sponge, there's hardly anybody to ask professionally, and a great many other taxa as well, flatworms, Nemertians, polychaetes. There's a huge number of species we encounter where the few taxonomists who are around, marine taxonomists, are hard pressed to be able to give us their time. So we still are looking at a lot of those species. We keep track of them. We do archive samples and keep our eyes and our ears, hopefully, on the pulse of change for coastal marine biodiversity. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. We have time for a question that we've got in the chat. Given the population crashes in many marine species over the last years, are these species potentially filling empty niches, so our invasive species, filling empty niches, or do we know that they are outcompeting other species?
Yeah, we don't know that yet. It's a good question for not only, for example, these shrimp species, but many of the other recent invaders that have appeared in the last 5, 10, 15 years. So rarely can we really nail down exactly what they are doing to previous resident species, many of which are earlier invasions, or to native species as well. We look for experimental data for those, and we have a small amount of experimental data compared to the number of invasions that we're looking at. So these are fundamental questions, but elusive right now for us to answer.
Great, thanks so much. We will have more questions for you at the end. So we are going to move on to our next speaker. Let me pull Jenn up. Okay, so our final speaker is Dr. Jenn Dijkstra, who is a research assistant professor at the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping in the Institute for the Study of Earth, Oceans, and Space at the University of New Hampshire. Her research focuses on the causes and consequences of marine invasions in nearshore coastal ecosystems. Jenn received her degrees from the University of New Brunswick, University of Bremen, and the University of New Hampshire. All right, I will pass it on to Jenn.
Thank you, Aly. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So thanks, Aly, for hosting this session. And I'll be talking about and for inviting certainly all of us to speak in it. And so I'll be talking about species and community response to climate change, kind of following Jim and providing some mechanisms as to why we see an abundance of invasive species in our communities. And so just to step back a little bit and say, you know, that climate change involves kind of multiple different processes. And for the Gulf of Maine, that includes a decline in salinity and coastal zones due to increased precipitation and storm events that enhance kind of coastal flooding. Temperature, where we see an increase in sea surface temperature, also bottom water temperature as well. We also see increases in maximum summer temperatures as well as maximum winter temperatures. Heat waves, we have more frequent heat waves and they with a longer duration. Another factor to consider is ocean acidification and specifically aragonite levels that will fall below or that may fall below the critical level where organisms can efficiently build their calcium carbonate shells or structures. And also dissolved oxygen concentrations, which are predicted to decline as well. And so for this talk, I'm really going to focus on temperature effects on species and communities. And so the main question that kind of myself and my collaborators are asking are kind of what are the interactions between temperature, phenology, and communities? And I'll present two studies that show how increasing temperatures can affect kind of the biology of individual species to then indirectly affect the community. And so the first study really centers on fouling communities, where we see this sort of shift in fouling community composition from the early 70s to really present day. And within this community, we'll focus on the species Botuloides violaceus. This is so this species wasn't observed in our historical community. It was first observed in 1982 and has since been a common, if not dominant member of our fouling as well as benthic community. And so to really talk about kind of temperature and range expansion or even reproduction of a species, you have to kind of get into the weeds of the species. And so I'm going to do that very briefly here, where this is a colonial ascidian or tunicate or sea squirt. They have a complex life cycle. And hopefully you can all see this, but in the colony, you'll see these holes, and each hole is an individual. And so these species reproduce through asexual reproduction, where each of these individuals can either replace itself with either one individual or with 1 to 4 individuals. And so therefore expanding the colony. This species also sexually reproduces. And in order for this species, it gets even more complicated, because in order for this species to sexually reproduce, the colony has to go through a number of asexual cycles. So where each individual is either replacing itself or replacing itself with more members. And asexual reproduction is dependent on temperature. Hopefully I didn't confuse you all there, but and asexual reproduction really begins at temperatures above 10 degrees Celsius. Okay, so we modeled the interaction between current and predicted maximum and seasonal elevations in temperature with both asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And we did this at 3 sites that span this latitudinal gradient along the Gulf of Maine: Salem, Mass, Damariscotta, Maine, and Eastport, Maine. And each of these sites, and you can see here in the lower left-hand side, This is Salem, Massachusetts, but each of these sites represents a seasonal or annual thermal gradient, where this dashed line represents seasonal temperatures and maximum temperatures in Salem, Mass. In the middle graph, it's annual or seasonal temperatures in Damariscotta, Maine. And then on the right-hand side, again, this dashed line, which really appears as a solid line here, represents the seasonal maximal temperatures in Eastport, Maine. And so our results, and again, this is really brief, but our results are essentially that increasing temperatures increase colony growth and also the reproductive capacity. And so what does this mean for the abundance, the local abundances of the species, as well as its potential to disperse? And so with sexual reproduction, each colony produces larvae that are released into the water column and distributed by currents. And so up in Eastport, our current predicted sexual reproductive events are biannual. That is that they only reproduce every other year. And this was historically. And what we see now, which we predicted in our model, was that they now reproduce annually. In Damariscotta, our model predicted annual reproduction, and our model predicted kind of under historical temperature patterns, annual reproduction, and it's now two reproductive events per year. And in Salem, Mass, again, historically, it would have been 2 reproductive events per year, and now it's 3 reproductive events per year. So what this means is that we would then predict that local abundances of the species would increase, but also we would see an increase in its potential to spread to other locations. The second study really focuses on shallow rocky communities. And kind of similar to these fouling communities, we see a regime shift or a shift in species composition from kelp to these short kind of tufty seaweed species. And with these compositional changes in subtidal rocky shores from a kelp to sort of a red filamentous dominated community, we also see a structural or biogenic shift in the habitat. And for example, with this kelp, it has a simple structure. It's either one blade or multiple blades. It's tall. It creates this 3-dimensional habitat, whereas this red filamentous algae, it's more complex. Its structure is more complex, but it has a shorter canopy height, so it creates a flatter habitat. And we also know that these changes in biogenic structure propagate up the food web, where it affects the species that live on the algae and also that are associated to the algae. So the big question is whether this novel habitat will persist. And the answer is likely yes. And we think this for a couple of different reasons. The first is temperature, and we know that temperatures are increasing in the Gulf of Maine, and many of our invasive seaweeds, and particularly the ones that are now dominant in the system, such as Dasyphonia or Bonomysonia, these short tufty guys, have a wide growth and reproductive temperature tolerance, so between 0 and about 30 degrees Celsius. And these temperature tolerances for both growth and reproduction are much wider than that of the native species kelp, whose thermal tolerance limits for growth appear to be about 20 degrees Celsius. And so we calculated the number of degree days as a function of decade, and we're finding that the number of degree days above 20 is significantly more between 2010 and 2018 and historically. So this means that kelp certainly has a limited growth, whereas our non-native species don't. The other piece is that the reproductive cutoff point for some species of kelp appears to be 16 degrees Celsius. And this is certainly true for the more common kelp, Saccharina latissima. And so at 16 degrees, the species has a limited capacity for reproduction, and above 16 degrees Celsius, it can't reproduce. And again, this is not, and again, we calculated the number of degree days as a function of decade. And we find that there's an increasing number of days where temperatures are above 16 degrees Celsius. And again, Dasyphonia, Bonomosonia, some species of Polysiphonia, they don't have these narrower thermal limits. And so what this really means is that our native species have a much shorter seasonal growth and reproductive season, and our invasive species have a much greater growth and reproductive season. The other factor that is in play, certainly in our system, is that the Northeast is experiencing more frequent and intense storm events, which are lasting longer. And so our common short red filamentous algae, so Bonomosonia, Polysiphonia, and Dasyphonia, are kind of these small little fluff balls, if you will, and would that have a weak attachment to the seafloor. And during strong storm events, they're easily ripped off from the substrate. And you can see that here. This is actually about 1 meter deep, and most of this is red filamentous algae. And you can see the kelp over here that's attached to the substrate. And these red filamentous species also have the advantage that they asexually reproduce and can take advantage then of free space when it's open. So essentially, when you have storm events and the red algae is ripped off, they can easily replace themselves. And so that allows for the persistence of this essentially red filamentous community. And so as both summer and winter ocean temperatures increase, we expect invasive species with wide thermal tolerances, or those that don't tolerate the historical and winter temperatures, to have an advantage over maybe native species whose growth and reproduction may be limited by increasing temperature. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Jen. That was super interesting. We do have one question directed for you, and then we'll open up questions for everyone. But our first question is, of the current invasive algal and tunicate species you've been assessing, which ones do you think have the potential to become even more of a problem in the face of climate change, beyond the species you were just describing?
Well, certainly one species, and I think Jeremy showed it in his slides, is Diplosoma listerionum. We already see that that's fairly common in not just felling communities, but also in the benthic zone. And it has been for a few years, but I suspect that it'll keep marching north as waters warm up, closer to Eastport. And Dasyphonia is one that has been around for a long time. But again, it's not as common as you go further north. But again, as the Gulf of Maine, as that northern piece of the Gulf of Maine begins to warm up, I would expect to see greater abundances of that species. Yeah.
Great. So I just want to remind our whole audience here to feel free to put questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom, and questions that any one of the three people who were just speaking can answer. I'll start us out with a question that has been put in Q&A. This one is for Jeremy or anyone else who wants to jump in. From Nancy Olmsted. I recall that there are some documented impacts of green crabs on salt marsh structure in the Northeast. Can you review these, and are they getting worse, better, no change?
I can speak to that first and let Jenn or Jim follow up. Yeah, we did. Well, our former research coordinator, Kristen Wilson, was a geologist out of UMaine. So she was interested in marsh surface retention and how the roots and rhizomes of the marsh help keep things together. We're seeing a lot of slumping in our salt marshes of the, particularly in the creek banks. So Kristen did some really neat work coupled with the Southern Maine healthcare system of running CAT scans on cores that she was taking from places that we knew we had tons of green crabs and other sites that seemed to have less population of green crabs. We were deriving this from our trapping data. Long story long, we found that many of the cores that came from the impacted sites with tons of green crabs had much less root and rhizome material and much more sand and air in the interstitial spaces of the cores. Basically, it was pretty wild running these things through a CAT scan. But not only that, we also found a full female crab inside one of the cores, about 1 meter into the marsh and about a half a meter under the marsh surface. So we found some pretty good information that they're burrowing. This work was a little bit tough to do, obviously, and we haven't been able to follow up on that work. However, just keeping our eye on the marshes, we're continuing to see a lot of slumping and burrowing in the marsh channels and wells. And again, we think that this is a lot of winter behavior, kind of newer winter behavior in New England, that in the past, super cold winters used to zap these things, kill them off in our estuaries. Now that things are a little bit warmer, we're finding them burrowed into the banks, trying to overwinter in large groups. And yeah, I'm assuming that problem is probably going to persist.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, are there any marine species, invasive marine species that any of you would like to speak to that have had a positive or maybe a neutral effect? So not necessarily these big negative impacts that we've seen, like by green crab you were just describing.
Well, we can speak to that very broadly. Around the world, there are a number of non-native species, marine species, that have become the basis of fisheries, whether those are the blue crabs in the Mediterranean, various species of Asian bivalves on the Pacific coast. So around the world, some seaweeds, Undaria in Europe, that are harvested or used for fisheries resources. So that has had a positive, perhaps economic or cultural effect, although their ecological or environmental effects might be somewhat negative. Some other species are used for bait, some are eaten. So again, along the cultural or societal sort of positive pathway. There is work around the world on some non-native species that provide additional structure to the community, and then native species may be enhanced in abundance by being able to have greater shelter. Whether an enhanced number of native species is a positive thing in an ecological sense is a different question. And so we use the word positive in a statistical sense in ecology very often just to mean an increased abundance, but it may not be good. And then in terms of neutral effects, gosh, you know, I would say that somewhere around 95% or more of all marine invaders that we're aware of have not been studied. So we just can't really say much about them. That's a very generic answer. Sorry.
Wow. That was a great answer. Thank you. This is a really interesting question that I'm excited that someone is asking here. For any of you marine presenters here, is there an interface between terrestrial land management and marine concerns? This person says, we are a land conservation organization located in a coastal area. And of course, terrestrial invasive species is a main focus of ours. Is there more we can do, or should we be conscientious from a land perspective, which includes salt marsh, to help address marine invasive concerns in our approach?
Well, we should have a symposium about that.
That's a good question.
As probably most of the 115 people right now listening know, we work in 3 different worlds typically: terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. And you can often have large symposium about terrestrial invasions, freshwater invasions, and marine invasions, and not a single person from one of the other habitats or environments is in that meeting. So we don't talk to each other enough about the parallels and similar challenges across this broad habitat menu. We might see each other on a picnic or something like that, but other than that, there's very little, surprising little exchange, which would be, much needed as we continue, especially with climate change issues. To the very question, I'm sure there are all kinds of interfaces that we have not yet explored. Of course, terrestrial systems, terrestrial land management has an effect on coastal marine systems quite a bit, whether it's freshwater drainage issues, whether it's sediment issues and things like that. There are a host of coastal terrestrial mammals that are not native that actually invade the intertidal zone and act as predators in marine systems. So I think the list probably is long, and I think this question could certainly be the basis of another special symposium, a session at a RISCC symposium.
I was going to say one of the ones that we certainly, I think are in New Hampshire are thinking a lot about is kind of managing nutrient waste into coastal waters, because many invasive seaweeds they can take up nutrients better than our native counterparts. And so that provides them an advantage. And so I think trying to manage, at least in, if possible, kind of the amount of nutrients, which is kind of an age-old management question, which tends to be a little contentious as well. But I think by managing that, there certainly is a pathway towards managing, towards kind of helping at least coastal invasions, or helping native species in coastal waters.
Great. Speaking of terrestrial organisms, I saw a deer eating algae on one of the Boston Harbor Islands this past summer. So terrestrial animals into the intertidal. So we have one last question and then we'll move on to break. Jenn and others from Aaron Gray, do you think that aquaculture or wind energy developments might favor certain invasive biofouling species? What might be done to prevent that new hard substrate from making the problem worse?
Well, it's also a difficult question. It would really depend on the placement of how far offshore it is, whether the invasive species have the ability to actually either naturally travel there or whether they have transportation there. So I think it's really just probably a matter of transport that will determine what species, whether native or invasive, will occupy or settle on the structures.
There's a little bit of work on just beginning work on some of the wind farms, offshore wind farms in Northern and Western Europe, on being colonized by invasives, their biofouling communities, which do include some invasives. So as we see that develop in New England, that will be an interesting topic to address, very much so, yeah.
And I'll just add that I just received an email about 2 weeks ago. There's a pretty contentious aquaculture issue going on in Belfast, Maine right now with a salmon pen that they want to put in Belfast Harbor. And I had the direct question of invasive species and hard substrate addition to the harbor, and if that would be a place for more invasives to live. And this would be right inside the harbor. So my immediate knee-jerk answer was yes, because it's close enough to shore and plenty of boats and traffic. So, but yeah, people are thinking about this, which I was encouraged to see, I guess, at least.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Jenn, Jim, Jeremy for being here today. And thank you all for watching.